I'm Karen Stevens, conducting an oral history interview with Mr. Christopher Broom on Monday, June 12, 2017, for the Georgia State University's Women's March Oral History Project. We're located at the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia. With us in the room is Erica Haig. Before, Christopher, we talk about your experiences regarding the Women's March, I'd like to get a little biographic information about you. Where were you born?
I was born in Columbia, South Carolina.
How did you get here from Columbia to Atlanta?
A very long story, but it's convoluted. I ended up in San Francisco for a while, and then back in South Carolina, and ultimately came here. My parents had moved here, and I had followed suit. So.
What year were you born?
1981.
Did your parents have political leanings when you were growing up?
Oh, very clearly, yes. My father is a huge supporter of the Republican conservative, and my mother is definitely much more liberal and democratic. So.
Yep. What's your profession?
It's a good question. I'm still figuring that one out. But for all intents and purposes, I'm an interior designer.
Do you have a particular political party that you support?
Historically, I've always supported the Democratic Party.
Yeah. Have you been involved in political activities before the march in January 21st?
Other than voting, no.
When did you decide, when and where were you when you decided that the march was something you might participate in?
It came to my attention from a good friend of mine, Chris Hunter Deviney, whom I actually live with. And she was going, and she is politically active and has historically been politically active. She used to work for Max Cleland, and she's always been a big issue voter on women's rights. And so she brought it to my attention, and out of love for her and any other person that I had known that might be impacted by this, I decided this was something that I wanted to do. And it felt inclusionary as well.
What were some of the issues that about the march that impacted you the most?
I would say that there were multiple factors. I think the biggest thing, though, for me was kind of not just the fact that this was a women's march, but I think it was also reactionary to in general to the election itself, and the candidate who ultimately won the presidency, Trump. So I think that was a big motivating factor for me, for sure. And also, I think the general consensus of the pussy grabbing off my comments were definitely uncouth to a level that I had not seen in a national political arena, and that was somehow condoned by the election results made me adamantly want to stand up against that.
What other issues did you see represented at the march?
Interesting you asked that. I looked around, and some of the signs actually told me. So there's a great sign that I saw, and it was a rainbow flag, and in each bar of color, there was a different slogan that had related to different movements at the time. So Black Lives Matter, Love is Love, Immigrants Make America Great, and Women's Rights are Human Rights.
So which march did you go to?
I went to the march here in Atlanta.
And how did you get to the march? Did you go with friends, and then how did you physically actually get to the march?
Absolutely. So again, my friend Chris had invited me, and she kind of got a bunch of us together. She was definitely the rallying cry for all of us. So there were at least two other couples that had gone. Her husband went, and interesting enough, her oldest child went, 13-year-old, who's transitioning to become a man. And so we all kind of went together, and we took Marta down. So.
What was that like? What was Marta like?
Calm, actually. And you started to see inklings of what to expect down the road as the train was filling up. You could start seeing signage. You could start seeing these knitted pussy hats in pink. You could see mothers and daughters. So you started seeing a sense of what the majority of people were using MARTA for that particular day.
Was it crowded?
Uh, Initially, it wasn't. We started at Lindbergh Station, moving down, but by the time we were down further towards the march, it did get crowded. But it wasn't standing room only.
Wasn't it raining that day?
It had started raining that day, and when we got out of the MARTA station and walking over to the starting point for the march, it was still drizzly, and we had geared up expecting the worst. And what was interesting is by the time that we had got to the Human Rights Center, the rain had stopped and the drizzles and stuff had stopped. So it was overcast, but the worst had not happened as anticipated.
What was your first impression when you got off MARTA of the atmosphere?
Well, I had to walk over a couple of ways, and by the time I came around the corner and saw where the Human Rights Center was, you could see it completely blocked out with people. And they had cordoned off an area. There's a lawn that sits in front of it, and that had been cordoned off. And I assume the anticipation was that they were trying to keep the crowd within those boundaries, but they hadn't. They had completely spilled out over onto the street and onto wrapping around the building, and even going down towards some of the parade route. So it definitely was a lot bigger than I think that even the organizers had anticipated.
Is this your first time participating in a march?
In a march? No. I'm gay, and I've done a lot of gay rights marches, historically during Gay Pride.
So why was it again important that you participate now?
The level of discourse had gotten to a place on a national platform I had never seen before or had not heard. I've heard in some historical contexts, and one often thinks of those as teachable moments and as not relevant to the here and now. But I was starting to feel as if they were. I started to feel as if this was now becoming a moment that one needs to speak up and say, that's not going to happen now. Because it takes an individual in order to speak up at those moments, to resist it. Democracy isn't won once and done. You have to continue to fight for it. And this was a moment in time where I felt like, finally, I need to speak up. This cannot be a moment where I just sit and be quiet.
Before the march, did you have expectations about the march itself?
I didn't really have many expectations. I will tell you, though, a friend of ours that went, Wendy, she was adamantly against the march, actually, in the sense that she's very pro-women's rights, but she just felt that it was a meaningless display, that it was for show, and that it gets everybody feeling better, but ultimately it doesn't result in any kind of action. And so she was dead set against it. And we all kind of chided her into going. And she ultimately came, and I have to say that by the time we were actually physically marching, because most of it was the build-up to the marching, it was a bunch of standing around, gathering, taking in the crowd. But by the time we were actually marching, she could start to see how there was an impact, not necessarily externally, but internally. And I think that was the biggest difference. And I kind of hooked onto that and started to realize that even though I didn't come with any expectations, that I could feel an internal shift once I had arrived, which was really shocking.
Once you were in the march, what was the atmosphere of the people around you?
Love, I think, is the biggest emotion, I would say. It was a lot of love and acceptance. There wasn't a lot of anger, vitriol. I mean, there was some in that in signage, but not in action. I think most people just wanted to come together and feel as if they weren't alone in their feelings of this kind of disappointment in how things had played out. And that was what was most amazing to me about it, was this feeling of camaraderie. You know, you come together. So often we feel alone in something that happens like this, and I can speak out on Facebook or whatnot, but it doesn't have the same impact as the actual physical coming together.
So how did that feel? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Gosh, how do you define that? It felt like a sigh, I think, is the way that I would describe it. So you take a sigh and there's immediate relief, right? As soon as you take a sigh. And to me, that's how that felt. It felt like immediate relief. It felt like just this unburdening instantly. And it felt emotional as well, in the sense that everything felt heightened, you know, that outpouring of love or the feeling of connectedness to others as well.
Your friends and family, did they know that you were marching? Were they supportive or not?
Most of my friends knew. I did tell, and also I posted on social media as well. So I wasn't being secretive about my support for it. I didn't really hear much amongst family members. I'm not very close with them, but I did notice that they didn't comment on anything. So I think that they were apathetic, maybe at best. So, but they weren't vitriolic against it.
Well, let me ask you this. When y'all are marching, I understand it was really crowded. How did y'all stay together?
Oh my gosh, that was difficult. And actually, some of us didn't. So our friend Kelly, who works at the Carter Center, there was a moment where John Lewis came through the crowd, and I got to actually see him, which was a great experience. It's the second time I've gotten to see him in a march. And so he kind of broke through there was a team before him, and they were kind of breaking through the crowd to get him to the front of the march, from his speaking engagement over to the head of the march and onto the finale of it. And as he was coming through, our friend Kelly saw him, and she's like, "Go, go, go, go!" And she was trying to hold people's hands and get them. And of course, the crowd, as soon as John Lewis had gone through, the crowd closed back up, and she was in this kind of bubble around John Lewis, moving all the way to the front. And so, as I asked her later on and found out that she ended up staying all the way at the front of that march and going on with him and hearing him. And the rest of us kind of had to hang back and stay close-knit in order to be connected. Because also, the crowds were so large that texting or calling was difficult. I imagine the cell phone towers were just inundated with so much data or calls. So service was getting spotty. So I would send a text amongst somebody else in the party, saying, "I'm here," and it might be 20 minutes later before, that text had pushed through or I had gotten a response. So, yeah.
Were you able to hear any of the speakers?
I wasn't, unfortunately. So I was at the lawn in front of the Human Rights Center, and I could tell that there was a speaker at the top near it, but there were no bullhorns or speakers that I could tell, and so we weren't able to hear it. And then we were so far behind on the march that John Lewis had wrapped up his speech when he got to the Capitol by the time we got there. So no, unfortunately, I wasn't able to hear any of the speakers.
Did y'all do any chants or hear any chants along the way?
I remember some of that. I don't remember what they were, but I definitely remember that there was some of that, at least in the beginning, when the milling about and standing was there. There were definitely some of that going through.
In the signage, you mentioned one
Mm-hmm.
that talked about a number of different issues. Did you notice any other signs?
Oh my God, that was half like the joy, actually, seeing some of the signs. Some of them really stood out. There were, of course, like some of the ones that became more nationally seen on multiple marches, such as "We Are the Resistance," and it had Carrie Fisher as Princess Leia on the center of it. There was another one that was very much in the style of the 2008 Hope poster of Obama, of a woman in a hijab. And that hijab was an American flag. And it said, "We the people," if I remember correctly. Yeah. So, yeah, and then there were other ones that were not as nationally done, which I remember being humorous at the time, but I can't recall them right now at the moment. But there was a lot of references to pussy grabbing.
Did you see any protesters who were protesting against the march?
That I did not see. So that was fortunate. I was anticipating that. Having gone to gay marches and so forth, I've experienced that in the past. They're usually quite vocal, and they gather in a place that is prominent. But in this particular instance, I didn't see any of those.
So did you see law officers or any police?
I did. There were quite a few law officers actually out. And I have to say, it was all very, very peaceful. And I saw, as I was marching, physically marching, there were a couple of them on barricades. And I would see women or other marchers coming up and giving them a high five and thanking them. And the officers seemed congenial.
These were people who were not marching, they were outside the barriers?
No, marchers were going up to the cops and
I see.
actually
Okay.
giving them high fives and I think just thanking them for keeping us safe and also for it to being focusing on it being a peaceful protest.
So after you finished, what was it like the rest of the day for you?
Well, it kind of just immediately broke up after the march, and there was a MARTA station, so we almost immediately hit back to MARTA. I did see Baton Bob out as it was going down. He was marching afterwards. He's a great local figure. And snapped a photo with him, and then we went on to MARTA to go back. So there was kind of a decompressing that happened after that.
What was it like, the atmosphere on MARTA, as the marchers got on MARTA to leave?
Quiet?
Quiet.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, it was quiet. Yeah.
And then the rest of the day for you?
Kind of a normal day, actually, you know. It was just going back to a regularly scheduled program of the day, you know. So for that, I think that we grabbed some food and then just everybody did their own thing after that. So.
What about the day later, once you saw, or did you see what the media was reporting there?
Yeah. So that evening, I had seen the numbers. I was quite interested in the numbers, actually, because they had been projected to be much lower, according to some of the Facebook's statuses that I was seeing, which is where I was getting most of the information in anticipation of the march, saying that something like 12,000 to 13,000 had said that they were interested in attending. I don't know about you, but I put up party posts on Facebook, and a lot of people often say they're interested in an event, and maybe half might show up. So I wasn't expecting a lot of participation, actually. And that evening, they had said something like 63,000, which was shocking. But I believed it. I mean, I saw the crowd, but it still was. It was quite amazing to hear that, to see that level of participation, which I had never been in an event to that level before. So that was kind of uplifting at the end of the day.
I think some of the media talked about marches around this country and some globally.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see that reported as well?
I did. So of course a lot of the attention was initially on the march in Washington, which there had been talk amongst our friend group of potentially going to, because buses had been set up and there were groups that were going from Atlanta themselves. Unfortunately, some schedules conflicted. We weren't going to be able to do so. So we came to find out that there was the march here locally. And then you tune in to the news and find out that, these local marches, such as Atlanta, but other places throughout like the Midwest and throughout the country, were also swelling in numbers, and had not seen that kind of level of participation throughout a country at one time. Was pretty amazing. And I had heard as well that there were some international marches, such as in Paris and a couple of other places, which was amazing to hear that a global event was going on all at the same time, essentially.
What were your feelings during the march?
I think during the march, I would say it was conversant to talking with friends that were marching. And I think there was a level of recognition amongst others. What was interesting is you would look at somebody else, and there was a sense of, I hear you too. It was, how do I describe this? It's, how sometimes you're walking along the street and you catch eyes with somebody and you're like, yeah, it's like kind of that recognition, like, I'm having a good day, maybe they're having a good day, and you have that same kind of recognition. It was like that, but amped up to a level I hadn't seen before, of that kind of connection where you could look to a complete stranger and feel like, hey, there's something here connecting us. That was pretty an amazing experience to that level. I've done it like sparingly on the side of a street or something, but to feel that, and that it wasn't just, it was different than gay marches as well. So I've gone to gay marches, and I'm gay, and we have gay supporters, and it's wonderful the first time you go, and it's supporting. But we kind of go because it's culturally the norm, I guess, in some respects now. I'm younger. I wasn't on the forefront at Stonewall and etc. But it's kind of culturally normative now. This didn't feel that way. This felt like a singular voice. This didn't feel like just a cultural norm of this is what you do, this is expected if you support this. It felt like I'm making an effort, that everybody was making an effort to show up, to do something different, to do something that was unexpected. So in that sense, it felt unique and different.
What do you hope will happen as a result of the march?
I hope that, well, I think with any goal of a march, I think that you hope that activism will sustain after the march, and that it'll come into the little things, into the day-to-day. Because activism and change are not glamorous. They're not big events like this. They come in calling up a congressman or writing or staying on top of local issues. It's about some of the smaller stuff. It's easy to do, but it's not glamorous, and it takes a certain level of commitment, and you hope that inspires people to say, oh my God, yes, I realize that there's something that needs to change here, and there's a big show of that, and then I would hope that kind of feeling gets sustained in some of the smaller actions as well,
Have you experienced any of that to any degree since the march?
Within specific to women's
Yes.
issues?
With respect to the march itself?
With respect to the march itself? I don't know, honestly. If I have to be frank, I'd say that I saw a lot of spectacle, but I don't know what the movement is. And part of that is on me as well, to do my due diligence as well, not just expecting the media to kind of tell me about what's going on or what has changed. I think that's one of the biggest differences as well, is to realize that I have to take personal ownership of these issues. I can't expect the media or to be a passive recipient, in other words, that I have to be more actively engaged.
So what's your fear?
Well, my fear is that that we're seeing a trend that's playing out, unfortunately, and that there's vocal opposition to it, but that isn't sustainable, that it may get worn down, or that it may not become effective between voicing an opposition and saying I'm against something, such as changing a Facebook profile or something, picture, and how does that translate into actual change or into activism, into the nitty-gritty, so to speak. One thing I did do after the march, though, is they had a day where you could lobby congressmen on behalf of women's issues here at the state capitol, and so I attended that. You can actually go and physically pull your representative off the floor, and you can talk to them about issues, and it's far more effective than just calling or writing, because they're seeing them face to face. Plus, I'm an actual constituent, and they're more likely to listen to a constituent that is actually voting for them than just if I have a general issue and I want to lobby you. So that was one thing I did do after the march.
Describe the moments that stand out the most.
Coming and seeing John Lewis come through the crowd, I think that was a really amazing experience for me, for what that man has represented in the past and for his stand on human rights. The fact that it started at the Human Rights Center, that we don't talk about women's rights. It didn't start at some women's place. It was about human rights. That spoke to me very much. That was kind of a very uplifting moment at the time, to kind of see him break through the crowd. Because there had been rumors, but it hadn't been confirmed to me, at least, that he was going to attend. And to see him there was remarkable. I mean, here's a man who led the march in Selma, and who had taken on riots and had seen amazing obstacles in his life for human rights, and he's still standing up for them. Even if they don't look like him on the outside, he's still standing up for them, and that's what I connected to. Because I did have issue of, should I attend this? I'm a man, I'm not a woman, I'm a supporter, absolutely. But is it my movement? Is there a place for me to speak out? Should I speak out? Ultimately, I did decide that was appropriate for me to be there as a sign in a show of support, and then to see not only myself, but I wouldn't say half the crowd, but a good percentage, more than I anticipated, was male, and to see congressmen and people on a national platform also speaking out locally was pretty uplifting. So I'd say that stood out the most.
You'd mentioned earlier that there were moments where you felt emotional. Could you talk about that a little bit more?
I'd say mostly it was standing before, because it felt like, at least, that it took forever for the march to get started. That was one chant that now that I'm thinking about it, it was something to the effect of, let's get this started, let's move, let's march. Everybody was just, they wanted to go. You could feel, and it wasn't because everyone was bored, it was they had a lot of energy and they wanted it to move. And so the anticipation is what I felt. That's where I felt emotional, was anticipation for all of this kind of outpouring of movement and energy and emotion. And to see the crowd, that was what was amazing. So I mentioned earlier that my friend Chris, her oldest child, was attending. That was so heartfelt for me, because he saw many of his other friends there as well. And so he's 14, they were all around the same age group. And to see them realize that there are people standing up for their rights, and that there are people who are willing to speak up for what's right, and to see that in action, that was what got me emotional. To see that sometimes they may have fears around what was going on, because they're not immune to hearing what's going on a national platform, and realizing that they have fears around that, about what does this say, and what does the future hold, and for them to then see adults as well speaking up against it. That was what was emotional to me, that they felt spoken for in a way.
How have you been feeling since the march?
It's hard to understand what I'm feeling, because I'm constantly bombarded with this constant assault of what's happening day to day on the unfoldings on this kind of presidency. And as mentioned earlier as well, that a major factor in my decision to vote was really about the election as well. So it's hard to separate that kind of media circus around this kind of bombardment around this presidency, and the legitimacy of what might be changing as far as these kind of social impacts or these social messages, and are they being heard or not. So it's hard to separate that, or to hear it outside of being crowded by that kind of media circus.
Was there anything about the march that surprised you?
The attendance, that surprised me. The sheer numbers. The one thing that did stick out that was kind of a negative, though, was it was a very Caucasian white crowd. I would have loved to have seen more inclusiveness. Atlanta is, so nationally, there's something like 13% African American makeup, but in Atlanta, especially, percentage is significantly higher. I didn't see that represented at the march. I would have loved to have seen that.
Since you've marched, what sort of advice could you give people who are trying to cope with this new government and agenda and marches, and what sort of advice could you give to people who may be watching this now or in the future, how to cope?
I think that there is something powerful about coming together. And I think that it's easy to sit back and say, well, it's just something vocal in a moment of time. It doesn't equate to change. But there is something comforting about knowing that you're not alone, and that you're not just a rallying cry against, some Facebook trolling or whatnot. There is something about the human connection when gathered together that is greater than the sum of its parts. When you speak in a collective voice like that, it feels empowering, and that empowerment then, for me, has felt like enough of an impetus to get behind other things to do, such as lobbying my congressman or whatnot. So I'd say, just do it. Just get on the bus, get out there and march. Just do it, even if you don't know what to expect. Just do it, because it's a powerful moment, and you don't know what the impact or the lasting thing could be on you as an individual. I think a lot of times we think in national or large-scale reactions or movements or change, but think about the change that can happen within you from attending something like that. That's what I would tell anybody in the future.
Has this experience changed you?
Absolutely. It makes me realize that I can't take rights for granted. Even in the most progressive settings, I still cannot take them for granted. And just because I may not be personally affected by a certain limiting factor on an infringement of rights doesn't mean that ultimately it doesn't affect me in the end, because they are universal. They are the biggest message I heard throughout the march was human rights, not just women's rights.
What would you say to anyone considering marching in the future?
Again, just do it. Just get out. Go with some friends if you can, if that's the threshold or the barrier that gets you over. But just go, because it takes on a whole other feeling once you're there. And it's hard to describe, but that was my feeling. I thought that I was gonna go. I had gone to marches in the past, that weren't necessarily political rallies, but there's something amazing about once you get in there and you feel the energy of a crowd. So just do it. That would be my suggestion.
Before we wrap up, I want to give you a chance to talk about or discuss anything else that we haven't talked about so far. Anything about the march, the value of this march in general.
I'd say one of the biggest impacts for me was seeing a change in a friend of mine and kind of dragging her along. She's extremely progressive and liberal and open-minded, and in no way was changed in her stance on equality of rights. But I think there was a change within her of seeing the impact of a gesture. A march is a gesture, ultimately, and there is an impact there. Yes, there is something immediately in the impact, for certain, because there's media blitz and there's a lot of chatter and a lot of emphasis put on it in the moment. But that gesture can also have a lasting impression on the individuals that attend, or potentially people who were witnesses to it. It doesn't get as much play or as much press, but it definitely has an impact. And ultimately, isn't that what a march or what a rally or what a resistance is you want a lasting kind of change that's impressionable to the individuals. Yeah.
So with that, Christopher Broom, thank you so very much for taking time to participate in this oral history project. I really appreciate the march that you did and your understanding of the march and sharing those thoughts and feelings with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.